The people who change your life rarely arrive with a warning. Every morning at exactly 8:15, Hannah Mitchell unlocked the front doors of the Maple Grove Community Library. The routine never changed. She parked her 10-year-old sedan in the same corner of the lot. She carried the same canvas tote bag filled with notebooks and half-finished reading lists. She paused beside the front window to switch on the lamps before the first visitors arrived. It was not a remarkable life. At least that was what most people would have said. Hannah was 29 years old, lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery, and spent more time around books than around people. She did not travel often. She did not attend glamorous events. Her social media pages sat mostly untouched. To the outside world, she was simply a librarian. One more ordinary face in a city filled with thousands of ordinary faces. Yet what people rarely notice was that libraries collected more than books. They collected stories. Every day, Hannah watched lives unfold between the shelves. Elderly widowers searching for company. Children discovering worlds larger than their neighborhoods. Single parents borrowing books they hoped might help them understand their children better. College students chasing impossible deadlines. She remembered names. She remembered birthdays. She remembered which novels made people smile and which biographies made them cry. Small things. Invisible things. The kind of details most people overlooked. That Thursday afternoon, rain tapped softly against the library windows while Hannah organized returned books behind the circulation desk. The building smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and polished wood. It was a comforting scent. Familiar. Safe. Outside, the gray sky hung low above the city. Inside, everything felt calm. A teenage student sat studying near the history section. An older couple quietly shared a newspaper. A mother read aloud to her daughter in the children's corner. The library existed in its own peaceful rhythm, separated from the noise of the world beyond its walls. Hannah liked it that way. Around 3 o'clock, she noticed an elderly man struggling to reach a book on a high shelf. Before he could ask for help, she crossed the room and retrieved it for him. He smiled gratefully. She smiled back. Moments later, she helped a young boy find a science book he needed for school. Then she fixed a printer issue for a frustrated teacher. Then she carried a stack of donations to storage. The afternoon passed exactly as most afternoons did. Helpful. Quiet. Unremarkable. Yet if someone had watched closely, they might have noticed something unusual. Hannah never treated any request as too small. She never hurried people away. She never acted as though their problems interrupted her day. She listened. Truly listened. In a world where everyone seemed desperate to be heard, Hannah had mastered the far rarer skill of paying attention. As evening approached, the rain intensified. Water streaked down the tall windows. Streetlights flickered to life outside. Hannah stood near the front desk reviewing inventory reports when the bakery owner from downstairs arrived carrying a paper bag of fresh pastries. It was a weekly tradition. He handed her a cinnamon roll and thanked her for helping his granddaughter find books she enjoyed reading. Hannah laughed softly and told him the girl had excellent taste. After he left, she returned to work. Nothing dramatic happened. No life-changing event. No shocking revelation. Just another ordinary day inside a quiet library. But sometimes the beginning of a story looks exactly like every day that came before it. Because somewhere beyond the rain-covered streets, a man whose world could not have been more different was about to walk through those doors. And when he did, neither of them would realize that the life Hannah Mitchell considered so ordinary was about to become a story worth remembering. The rain did not stop when the man arrived. It fell harder, as if the city itself was trying to blur the moment before it fully formed. Hannah Mitchell did not notice him at first. She was behind the front desk, stamping returned books and adjusting a stack of newly donated novels. The library had grown quieter in the last hour. Fewer visitors. Softer movement. The familiar transition between afternoon and evening. Then the front doors opened. A cold draft moved through the room, carrying the scent of rain and the faint echo of the outside world. Hannah looked up automatically, expecting a student or a late visitor searching for shelter from the weather. Instead, she saw him. He stepped inside without hesitation. Tall. Composed. Dressed in a dark tailored coat that did not belong to this place. Everything about him contrasted with the library's calm atmosphere. Even the way he paused just inside the doorway felt deliberate, as if he were assessing not just the room, but the rhythm of it. Hannah's first thought was simple. He is not supposed to be here. The man scanned the space slowly, not in confusion, not in curiosity alone, more like recognition without familiarity, as if he understood places like this in theory but rarely entered them in practice. A few visitors glanced up briefly before returning to their books. No one reacted strongly. To them, he was just another stranger. But Hannah noticed something others did not. He did not look lost. He looked aware. He began walking between the shelves, his steps quiet against the wooden floor. He did not reach for a book. He did not ask a question. He simply observed. Hannah continued her work, though her attention had shifted without permission. She tried to ignore it. That was what she always did when something disrupted the routine. But something about his presence refused to blend into the background. It was not loud. It was not disruptive. It was precise, controlled, like a single note held too long in an otherwise silent room. After several minutes, he stopped near the literature section. His hand hovered briefly near a row of classic novels but did not touch them. Instead, his gaze moved toward the front desk, toward her. When their eyes met, the moment did not break. It stretched. Hannah felt it immediately. Not fear. Not discomfort. Something closer to awareness. The feeling of being observed in a way that was unusually intentional. She nodded politely, the way she would with any visitor. A professional acknowledgement. Neutral. Safe. He did not nod back immediately. Instead, he held her gaze for another second longer than socially necessary, then turned away as if nothing had happened. That should have been the end of it. But it was not. He moved through the library with increasing slowness, as if reconsidering every step. Hannah returned to her tasks, but her focus was fractured now. She found herself watching him between responsibilities. He was not behaving like the usual visitors. He was not browsing. He was studying. Not the books. The space. The patterns. The way people moved. The way she moved. At one point, a child dropped a book near the reading corner. Hannah moved to help, but before she could reach it, the man had already picked it up and handed it back gently. The child smiled and ran off without hesitation. Hannah paused. That was the first small interruption that felt meaningful. Not because of the action itself, but because of how naturally it had been done. As if helping was not a decision for him. It was instinct. Later, as closing time approached, the remaining visitors began to leave. Chairs were straightened. Books were returned. Lights softened. The man approached the front desk for the first time. Hannah straightened slightly, preparing for a question, a request, something ordinary. Instead, he simply placed a book on the counter. It was an old edition, worn at the edges. Hannah glanced at it before meeting his eyes again. "Checking it out?" she asked. "Not today," he replied calmly. His voice was steady, measured. "I was just looking." A pause followed. Not uncomfortable, just present. Hannah nodded and reached for the book. "It is a good selection," she said. "Most people overlook it." Something subtle changed in his expression at that sentence. Not surprise. Recognition again. As if he understood the idea of being overlooked more deeply than he intended to show. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, rain continued to fall against the glass walls of the library. Finally, he turned slightly toward the exit. But before leaving, he spoke again. "You notice people here," he said. It was not a question. Hannah hesitated. "That is part of the job." "No," he replied quietly. "It is not." Then he left. The doors closed behind him. The sound of rain filled the space he had occupied. Hannah stood still for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the empty doorway. Something about the exchange lingered in the quiet air. Something she could not immediately name. And somewhere beyond the rain, the man who had just walked out was already thinking about the woman who had not looked away even once. Some meetings end when people walk away. Others begin there. Hannah Mitchell discovered that over the next few days. She told herself the stranger from the library was simply another visitor. A man passing through. Someone she would probably never see again. The explanation sounded reasonable. Unfortunately, it did not feel true. Monday arrived with clear skies and the familiar rhythm of work. Books were returned. Questions were answered. Children gathered near the reading corner after school. Life resumed exactly as it always did. Yet every now and then, Hannah caught herself glancing toward the front entrance. Not intentionally, not hopefully, just automatically, as though part of her expected to see the dark-coated stranger standing there again. He never appeared. By Wednesday, she felt slightly embarrassed by her own curiosity. She barely knew anything about him. Not his profession, not his background, not even his full name. All she knew was that he had noticed things most people ignored. And somehow that fact lingered longer than it should have. Across the city, Marco DeLuca sat in a conference room overlooking downtown. Financial reports covered the table. Executives discussed acquisitions, contracts, and future investments. Important conversations. Expensive conversations. Yet despite the significance of the meeting, part of his attention remained elsewhere. It returned repeatedly to a quiet library filled with old books and warm lighting. More specifically, it returned to the woman behind the front desk. Marco rarely thought about strangers twice. His world moved too quickly for that. Decisions were made. Situations were resolved. People came and went. Yet Hannah Mitchell had managed to occupy space in his thoughts without effort. Not because she demanded attention, because she never did. That distinction mattered more than he cared to admit. Late Thursday afternoon, a delivery truck arrived at the library carrying several large boxes of donated books. The shipment had arrived unexpectedly early. Hannah stepped outside to help unload them. The driver apologized for the short notice. She smiled and assured him it was not a problem. Together they moved box after box toward the rear entrance. By the time they finished, she was slightly out of breath and laughing at the sheer number of donations. It was then she noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Nothing unusual about that. Cars pass constantly. Yet something about this one felt familiar. Before she could think further, traffic moved between them. When she looked again, the vehicle was gone. She dismissed the thought and returned inside. Later that evening, after the library closed, Hannah remained behind organizing the newly arrived books. She enjoyed the quiet after hours. The building felt different when empty. Softer. More reflective. She sorted titles into categories and created inventory lists, while gentle music played through a small speaker near her desk. Hours passed unnoticed. Then she found something unusual. Tucked inside one of the donated books was a handwritten note. The paper was old and slightly folded. Across the front, in elegant handwriting, were 6 simple words. "The right story finds you eventually." Hannah smiled. It sounded like something a librarian should believe. She placed the note carefully inside her planner before finishing her work. At nearly the same moment, several miles away, Marco stood beside the window of his office watching city lights emerge one by one. Thousands of stories unfolding simultaneously. Thousands of people moving through lives that would never intersect. Yet somehow his thoughts continued returning to one person among them. A librarian who treated every visitor as if they mattered. A woman who noticed others without realizing she herself was becoming impossible to overlook. And although neither of them knew it yet, the brief encounter inside that quiet library had already begun changing the direction of both their lives. The next time Hannah saw him, she almost convinced herself it was coincidence. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the library was unusually busy. A school group had arrived, filling the reading area with noise, movement, and scattered questions. Hannah moved between tables, helping teachers organize students and guiding children toward appropriate books. It was the kind of chaos she handled well. Structured chaos. Predictable chaos. Then at the edge of the crowd, she noticed him. Marco DeLuca stood near the entrance, not stepping fully inside at first. He watched the room quietly, as if waiting for a natural moment to join it. His presence was subtle, but it changed the atmosphere immediately. Hannah felt it before she fully understood it. A shift in attention. A sense that the room had gained another layer of awareness. She told herself he was probably there for something unrelated. A meeting. A delivery. A brief stop. Yet when he finally stepped inside, he did not speak to anyone else. He walked directly toward the shelves. Again. Not rushing. Not wandering. Purposeful. Hannah tried to continue her work, but her awareness kept returning to him. He moved differently from other visitors. Not distracted. Not uncertain. He paused only when something genuinely interested him. Otherwise, he observed. Always observed. At one point, a child accidentally dropped a stack of books near him. Before Hannah could react, Marco had already bent down and helped gather them. The child smiled. He nodded once and returned the books without comment. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but Hannah noticed how naturally it was done, as if helping others required no decision at all. Later, when the school group left, the library returned to its usual quiet. Hannah resumed shelving books while the remaining visitors settled into reading corners. The afternoon light stretched across the wooden floors, turning everything soft and golden. Marco eventually approached the circulation desk again. Hannah looked up as he stopped in front of her. "You visit often for someone who does not borrow anything," she said lightly, trying to sound professional rather than curious. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly around the room before meeting her eyes. "I am still deciding," he said. "On a book?" she asked. A faint pause followed. "On whether something here is worth taking with me." The answer did not make complete sense. Not in a literal way. But something in his tone suggested it was not meant to. Hannah studied him for a moment, then nodded politely. "Most things here are worth reading," she replied. "You just have to take the time." Something flickered in his expression at that. Not amusement. Not disagreement. Recognition. As if her words had landed somewhere deeper than intended. He stayed a few seconds longer, then turned toward the exit. Before leaving, he stopped briefly at the doorway. Without looking back, he said, "You are better at noticing people than you realize." Then he left. The door closed softly behind him. The library returned to silence almost instantly, but Hannah did not move right away. She stood still behind the counter, replaying the sentence in her mind. It was not a compliment she was used to hearing, and it was not one she fully understood. That evening after closing, she wrote it down in her notebook without knowing why. Across the city, Marco stood once again in his office, reviewing nothing in particular. His attention was elsewhere. Not on numbers. Not on reports. On a quiet space filled with books and a woman who treated attention like it was a responsibility rather than a privilege. He had not planned to return, but as he looked out at the city lights, he realized something had already made that decision for him. The following week began with an unexpected problem. Hannah Mitchell arrived at the library on Monday morning to find 3 members of the City Facilities Department waiting near the front entrance. Their expressions were serious. Their clipboards were full. At first she assumed it was a routine inspection. Then she learned the truth. A funding review had identified several maintenance concerns throughout the building. Nothing dangerous. Nothing urgent. But enough to place future operational budgets under scrutiny. The director tried to remain optimistic, yet concerns spread quietly. Among the staff, Hannah listened as estimates were discussed. Repairs. Delays. Budget reallocations. The numbers sounded discouraging. The library had always operated with limited resources. Even small financial complications could create lasting problems. Throughout the day, visitors continued arriving without realizing anything was wrong. Children attended reading programs. Students studied for exams. Elderly residents gathered near the newspaper section. Life moved forward normally. Hannah did her best to focus on helping people, but the uncertainty remained in the back of her mind. She cared about the building more than most people realized. It was not just a workplace. It was a refuge for hundreds of people who depended on it. That evening after closing, she walked slowly through the empty aisles. The shelves stood quietly beneath soft lights. Familiar. Comforting. She wondered what would happen if programs were reduced or services cut back. The thought troubled her more than she wanted to admit. Across the city, Marco DeLuca received information about the situation before the library director had even finished preparing the official report. The update appeared among dozens of routine briefings. Normally, it would have received little attention. This time was different. He read every page. Then he read them again. The issue was manageable. Not large enough to attract public attention. Not severe enough to become a political concern. Just another community institution facing financial pressure. The kind of situation most influential people ignored because there was little benefit in getting involved. Yet as Marco reviewed the details, he found himself thinking less about the building and more about the woman who worked inside it. He could already imagine Hannah's reaction. She would worry about the visitors before herself. She would search for solutions. She would volunteer extra hours if necessary. She would do everything possible to protect a place she believed mattered. The prediction was easy because it matched everything he had already learned about her. 3 days later, something unusual happened. A regional literacy foundation announced an expansion of its community grant program. Several organizations became eligible for additional funding opportunities, including the library. Staff members reacted with cautious optimism. Applications were submitted. Meetings were scheduled. No one expected immediate results. Then another surprise arrived. A local donor offered support for facility improvements. Then another organization volunteered assistance with educational programming. One positive development followed another. Small individually, significant together. Hannah listened carefully as updates were shared during a staff meeting. The director appeared genuinely stunned by the sudden momentum. Everyone did. Hannah smiled with the others, grateful for the improvement. Yet a quiet question formed in her thoughts. Why now? The timing felt almost impossible. Problems had existed for months. Solutions arrived all at once. She could not explain it. Neither could anyone else. Later that afternoon, she stood near the circulation desk watching sunlight spill across the floor through the front windows. The library felt lighter somehow. Hopeful. Alive. Visitors moved between shelves carrying books, conversations, and possibilities. Hannah smiled softly and returned to work. She never noticed the black sedan parked briefly across the street. She never saw the man inside watching the library entrance before driving away. And she never realized that someone had quietly decided a place important to her should be given a chance to survive. It began with a simple envelope. No logo. No return address. It was delivered to the library just after opening hours, placed neatly on the front desk where Hannah Mitchell usually sorted the morning mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Clean. Professional. Inside was a formal notice confirming the approval of a multi-phase community support initiative. It outlined funding allocations for educational spaces, facility improvements, and long-term sustainability programs. The language was standard, administrative, impersonal. Yet the impact of the document was anything but ordinary. Hannah read it twice. Then a third time. The figures were precise. The approval dates recent. The signatures legitimate. Nothing appeared unusual on the surface. And yet the timing felt almost too perfect to ignore. Only days after the library had faced potential budget reductions, a structured support plan had emerged that resolved multiple issues at once. That afternoon, staff members celebrated quietly. Repairs were scheduled. Programs stabilized. Supplies were secured for the coming months. Relief spread through the building like a slow exhale. Hannah joined in the appreciation, genuinely grateful for the outcome. But beneath her relief, curiosity lingered. That evening, after the last visitor left and the doors were locked, she remained behind longer than usual. The library was silent except for the soft hum of the heating system. She stood near the circulation desk, holding the notice in her hands again. Something about it did not feel random, not suspicious, not threatening, just connected. Across the city, Marco De Luca reviewed a separate confirmation report on his desk. The document tracked the final execution of several quiet financial adjustments that had supported multiple community institutions over the past weeks. The library was listed among them. Everything had been carried out cleanly, indirectly, without exposure. There were no names attached to the operational channels. No direct references to him. That was intentional. His methods were designed to remain invisible to the people they affected. And yet, as he read the final summary, his attention did not stay on the numbers. Stayed on her. Hannah Mitchell had not been part of the plan in a formal sense. She was not a stakeholder, not a beneficiary in any structured way. She was simply the reason the structure existed at all. a detail he had never needed to explain to anyone else. Several days passed before their paths crossed again. This time it was not at the library. It was at a small public gathering hosted by a local civic organization. The event was modest, informational, designed to connect community leaders with residents. Hannah attended reluctantly, representing the library. Marco attended without announcement, as he often did in public settings where visibility was unnecessary. When they saw each other, neither reacted immediately. There was no surprise from her side, only recognition, as if part of her had already expected this moment eventually. "You are here often for someone who does not seem involved in public events," Hannah said after a pause. Her tone was polite but observant. Marco regarded her calmly. "I could say the same about you," he replied. She allowed a small smile. "Libraries are public spaces. It comes with the job. So does responsibility," he said. The answer was simple, direct. It lingered between them longer than expected. The conversation continued briefly, touching on programs, literacy initiatives, and community challenges. Nothing personal was spoken aloud, yet something unspoken moved beneath the surface of every sentence. When the event ended, people began to leave in small groups. Hannah stepped outside first, holding a folder against her chest. The evening air was cool, the street quiet. She stood near the sidewalk waiting for her ride.
Marco approached moments later.
Not directly, not intrusively, just enough to be within conversation distance. "The library is doing better," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she replied. "It has been unexpected." A pause followed. Hannah studied him for a moment. "Do you ever feel like things change around you for reasons no one explains?" The question was casual, but her eyes were searching. Marco did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the streetlights stretching down the avenue. "Sometimes," he said finally. "And when they do you try to find the reason?" she asked. His gaze returned to her. Calm, measured. "Not always," he said. "Sometimes the result is enough." The answer should have ended the conversation, but it did not. Instead, it created a quiet understanding between them that neither fully acknowledged. When her ride arrived, Hannah turned slightly. "Thank you for the conversation," she said. "It was unusual." "Unusual is not always negative," Marco replied. She nodded once, then left. He remained where he was, watching until the car disappeared into traffic. And for the first time, the distance between observation and involvement no longer felt like something he controlled. It felt like something that had already begun to close. After their last encounter, something subtle changed in the way Hannah Mitchell moved through her days. It was not sudden. It was not obvious. It was a quiet awareness, like noticing a new sound in a familiar room. The library remained the same. The routines remained unchanged. Yet she found herself occasionally pausing longer than necessary near the front entrance, as if expecting something she could not define. Marco De Luca, on the other hand, did not experience change in the same way. For him, change was usually measured in decisions, outcomes, and control. But this situation did not fit any of those categories. It existed outside his usual structure of understanding. He did not initiate contact again immediately. Instead, he observed distance itself. Not in a physical sense, but in timing patterns and coincidence. He noticed how often she arrived early, how consistently she stayed late, how rarely she seemed to think about herself when helping others. These were not new observations, but now they carried weight they did not have before. One afternoon, the library hosted a small community literacy workshop. Attendance was higher than expected. Hannah stood near the front organizing materials while volunteers helped distribute reading packets. The room was filled with quiet conversation and the soft turning of pages. Marco arrived without announcement and stood near the back, blending into the edge of the room as he often did. No one paid special attention to him. That was intentional. He did not come to be seen. He came because she was there. During the session, a discussion arose about expanding access to reading programs for underserved neighborhoods. The conversation was practical at first, focused on funding limitations and logistical barriers. Hannah contributed carefully, offering solutions based on real experiences rather than theory. Her voice was steady, clear, thoughtful. Marco watched without interrupting. Not the discussion. Her. When the meeting ended, people began to leave in clusters. Hannah remained behind again, helping stack chairs and organize leftover materials. It was a habit she never seemed to question. Responsibility, once accepted, stayed with her until the end. Marco approached only when the room was nearly empty. "You do not delegate very often," he said. Hannah looked up briefly, not surprised by his presence this time. "There is not always someone to delegate to," she replied. "Or you prefer to do it yourself," he said. She considered the statement for a moment. "Sometimes it is faster," she said simply. He nodded slightly, as if accepting the answer while understanding it meant more than she said. A silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just present. Outside, the evening light had softened into early dusk. Through the windows, the city appeared quieter than usual. Hannah gathered the last of the materials and placed them into a box. When she turned back, Marco was still there. "The library received additional support recently," she said suddenly, as if the thought had been waiting for a natural opening. "Yes," he replied. She studied him for a moment. "It came at the right time," she continued. "Almost too perfectly." Marco did not respond immediately. His expression remained unchanged. "Sometimes timing is the only thing people notice," he said finally. Hannah tilted her head slightly. "And what should they notice instead?" The question lingered in the space between them. Marco looked toward the empty rows of chairs before answering. "What makes it necessary in the first place?" The answer did not fully satisfy her curiosity, but it did not dismiss it either. That mattered more than she expected. As she prepared to leave, Hannah hesitated near the door. "Do you always appear when things are changing?" she asked. It was not an accusation. It was observation.
Marco's gaze met hers.
"Calm. Steady. I appear when I am needed," he said. She did not challenge the statement. Instead, she nodded once and stepped outside. Marco remained inside the quiet room long after she left, surrounded by empty chairs and fading light. For a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, he found himself in an unfamiliar position. Not control. Not distance. Something in between. And for the first time he did not attempt to define it. The first real shift happened on a day that looked no different from any other. Hannah Mitchell arrived at the library earlier than usual because a shipment of archived books needed cataloging before opening hours. The morning air was cool, the streets still quiet, and the building felt almost suspended in silence when she unlocked the doors. She expected nothing unusual. Nothing ever began that way. By mid-morning, however, a formal delivery arrived. 2 sealed envelopes, both marked with institutional headers she did not recognize at first glance. One contained confirmation of extended funding for literacy outreach. The other outlined a long-term partnership proposal involving multiple community libraries across the city. Hannah read them carefully once then again. The language was official, structured, carefully worded. Yet the scale of support described inside those pages felt disproportionate to what the library had been expecting. Staff members reacted with visible relief when she shared the news. The director called it a rare stroke of perfect timing. A few volunteers even laughed in disbelief, saying it felt like the library had been lucky for once. Hannah smiled with them, but something inside her remained quietly unsettled. She had learned to recognize patterns in small details, and this felt like a pattern forming too quickly to be accidental. Across the city, Marco De Luca stood in a different kind of silence. His office overlooked the financial district, where glass buildings reflected the late morning sun. On his desk lay a final report confirming the completion of several coordinated funding decisions. Everything had been executed exactly as intended. No exposure.
No attribution.
No visible connection to him. That was how it was supposed to work. Yet his attention was no longer on the efficiency of the system. It was on the outcome. Specifically, on the way that outcome was now tied to a place he had never intended to think about so frequently. A library. And a woman who worked inside it. He did not call it attachment. That word did not belong in his vocabulary. But he also did not dismiss it anymore. Later that week, Hannah attended a city-sponsored community review session regarding public education resources. The meeting was held in a neutral civic hall, filled with representatives from various institutions. Discussions moved between funding models, accessibility concerns, and long-term planning strategies. Hannah participated when necessary, offering grounded observations from her experience at the library. She spoke clearly without exaggeration, focusing on what she had seen rather than what she hoped for. Marco was already there when she arrived, seated near the back as always, observing rather than participating. Their eyes met only briefly when she entered. No acknowledgement beyond recognition. The meeting progressed without disruption until a discussion arose about resource allocation priorities. A disagreement formed between two groups, each arguing for different community focuses. The conversation became tense but remained controlled. Hannah eventually spoke, not to dominate the discussion, but to clarify a practical perspective based on real impact she had witnessed. Her words shifted the tone of the room, not because they were forceful but because they were grounded. After the meeting ended, people gathered their belongings and left in small groups. Hannah remained behind again, organizing notes and returning chairs to their proper places. It was instinct at this point. Responsibility carried beyond obligation. Marco approached only when the room was nearly empty. "You tend to stay after everyone leaves," he said. Hannah did not look surprised. "Someone has to," she replied. "Or you believe you should," he corrected gently. She paused at that, then continued stacking papers. "Maybe both are true," she said. A faint silence followed. Not heavy, just thoughtful. Marco stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance. "The changes happening at your library," he said, "are not random." Hannah looked up slowly. Her expression remained calm, but her attention sharpened. "I was starting to think that," she admitted. He studied her carefully. There was no urgency in his expression, no attempt to convince, only acknowledgement. "Most people accept improvement without questioning its origin," he said. "You are not most people." Hannah closed the folder in her hands. "Then what am I supposed to do with that?" she asked. Marco did not answer immediately. For the first time, his silence carried weight that was not strategic but reflective. "That depends," he said finally, "on whether you want to know the truth behind it." The question lingered between them long after the room had emptied completely. And for the first time since this entire sequence began, Hannah did not dismiss her curiosity as unnecessary. And Marco did not dismiss his involvement as temporary. The truth did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Over the following days, Hannah Mitchell noticed something she could not easily explain away. The library continued to receive support. Not in dramatic bursts, but in steady, carefully timed improvements. Equipment upgrades appeared just when older systems began to fail. Book donations increased in categories the library had been struggling to maintain. Community interest programs suddenly found renewed participation. Nothing appeared unnatural on its own. But together, the sequence felt too coordinated to be coincidence. Hannah began paying closer attention to timing. She checked dates on funding notices. She compared them with internal reports. She reviewed delivery schedules and approval emails. The consistency unsettled her more than the changes themselves. Everything pointed toward structure, intent, direction. Yet no clear source was ever visible. One afternoon, while organizing records in the back office, she found a printed summary that had been mistakenly left in a return supply folder. It listed multiple community institutions receiving parallel support adjustments. Her library was one of them. The document contained no explanation, only results. And among the listed institutions she noticed something else. The same pattern of improvement extended across locations that shared no obvious administrative connection. Hannah sat with the document longer than she intended. A thought formed that she immediately tried to dismiss. Someone was coordinating this, not randomly, not publicly, deliberately. That evening, she stayed late again after closing hours. The library was empty except for the soft hum of the building systems and the faint glow of desk lamps. She stood near the circulation counter, staring at nothing in particular, trying to organize her thoughts into something reasonable. Across the city, Marco De Luca reviewed the final alignment of the support structure he had been quietly shaping. The results were stable. No disruptions had been reported. No inquiries had reached public attention. From an operational standpoint, everything was working exactly as intended. Yet his focus was no longer on efficiency alone. It was on the consequences of visibility, or rather, the lack of it. Because despite how carefully everything had been designed to remain invisible, one person had begun noticing the edges of it. Hannah Mitchell. She was not supposed to see the structure beneath the outcomes. That was the point of the structure. And yet she was seeing it anyway. Later that week, their paths crossed again in a way neither had arranged. The library hosted a regional coordination meeting for community education initiatives. Representatives from multiple districts gathered to discuss long-term planning. Hannah attended as part of the hosting institution. Marco attended without formal announcement, as he often did when oversight was required without attention. When she saw him enter, Hannah did not react immediately. But something in her posture shifted slightly, as if a question she had been carrying finally had a possible direction. The meeting progressed through standard discussions. Funding distribution, program expansion, infrastructure support. Hannah contributed when necessary, but her attention repeatedly drifted toward the man seated near the back of the room. He did not participate in the discussion. He did not need to. After the meeting ended, attendees began to leave in groups. Hannah remained behind, collecting documents and organizing chairs as she usually did. The room slowly emptied until only a few people remained. Marco approached once the space was quiet. Not abruptly. Not intrusively. "You have been looking at the data more closely," he said. It was not a question. Hannah placed a stack of papers on the table before responding. "It is difficult not to," she said, "when the pattern keeps repeating itself." He studied her for a moment. There was no surprise in his expression, only acknowledgement. "Then you understand it is not random," he said. Hannah met his gaze directly. "I understand that someone is behind it," she replied. A pause followed. Not tense, just decisive. Marco did not deny it. That silence confirmed more than words would have. Hannah exhaled slowly, processing the weight of what that meant. "Why?" she asked finally. It was the first time she had allowed the question to fully surface. Marco looked away briefly, toward the empty rows of chairs before answering. "Because some things are only preserved when someone chooses to preserve them," he said. The answer was not complete, but it was honest in its own way. Hannah considered it carefully. "And you chose this library," she said. "Not the others." "Yes," he replied. The simplicity of the answer carried more meaning than explanation. Another silence followed. This one longer. More uncertain. Finally Hannah spoke again. "If I had not noticed," she said, "would you have ever said anything?" Marco's expression remained steady. "No," he said. The truth settled between them without movement. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just real. Hannah nodded slowly, as if accepting something she had not yet fully understood. "Then I suppose I am glad I noticed," she said quietly. Marco did not respond immediately. For the first time he seemed to be weighing something that could not be calculated. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "So am I." Outside, the city continued as it always did. Unaware. Unchanged. But inside the quiet library, something irreversible had already begun. Not an event. Not a decision. A recognition that neither of them could take back.